Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this evening's Colors of Glory virtual meet. I'm Dhanesh Sankhyan, one of the coordinators of this event. So let me begin by introducing what Colors of Glory Foundation is. Colors of Glory Foundation is an organization with the unique mission of bringing India's armed forces closer to the hearts and minds of ordinary Indians, probably the first of its kind in the country. We are proud that we have been highlighting India's rich military heritage by hosting numerous outdoor and indoor events during the past 4 years since we came into existence. Although we have been constrained to restrict our activities to these virtual events for almost a year now due to the pandemic threat, we have made it worthwhile for the participants by hosting interesting talks and presentations by eminent speakers on a variety of topics. And please be rest assured that we will bounce back with all action as soon as the situation improves. We eventually plan to extend our activities to other cities in India as well. Indeed, we'll continue with the virtual meets as well as to reach out to our audience all over India and overseas. We invite all of you who are not yet members of our organization to come to our fold. The modalities of obtaining a membership are available on our website. The URL, which appears at the bottom of our e-invites. Be a member and be a part of a unique initiative. In case you have an inclination to write, irrespective of whether you are a member or not, we invite you to contribute blogs for our website, which is already reached more than 100 popular blogs on India's proud military past. Please feel free to call or email us for any clarifications. Now, before we commence today's event, please permit me to present a kaleidoscopic view of what we do. And now I request Lieutenant Colonel S.V. Sundar to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. Am I audible to everybody, please?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
sir.
At the outset, I would thank Captain Ramchandran for having given me this opportunity to introduce the speaker of the evening, Colonel Rakesh Singh Sidhu, Sena Medal. It's not because that I know Colonel Sidhu personally. I have the highest regard for this officer. He came to take over the battalion 12 Mech from 15 Mech when I was the second in command. And I served for 2 years plus as his 2IC before he relinquished his command. And it was during this period that the Kargil ops were on and the battalion was deployed somewhere in the western sector. Therefore, I have known him personally very well. So apart from the official profile, which I shall of course be presenting, Captain Ramchandran has also asked me, without wasting too much time, to share a little bit about his personal attributes and abilities, so that it will be clear as to what type of a person he is, which it will be my pleasure to do. Colonel Sidhu is an alumnus of the Colonel Brown School at Dehradun and a postgraduate in history from the Delhi University. He was commissioned from the Officers Training Academy in 1978 initially into 7 Punjab, which later became 8 Mech. Then he went on to 15 Mechanized Infantry. It was during his stint at 15 Mechanized Infantry that he was involved in the Sri Lanka operations. And he was involved in the Sri Lanka operations right from the time of induction till the time of de-induction, and also earned his Sena Medal for conspicuous gallantry during the Sri Lanka operations. Therefore, what Colonel Sidhu would be speaking to us is not second-hand information, but information of a soldier who's had his boots on the ground. Later, after coming from 15 Mech, as I said, he came into 12 Mech and took over the battalion. And early in his service, he also was deployed in the Siachen Glacier Base Camp during Op Meghdoot in 1984. That was the time when India had occupied the dominating heights as far as the Siachen Glacier is concerned. So he has a fair idea of the mountain warfare of the glacier goes. And during his distinguished career spanning almost 3 decades, he also held senior staff appointments with an infantry brigade and a division. Apart from his combat experience in Sri Lanka, he is an avid China watcher. And many of his articles have been published in newspapers and prestigious journals, both in India and abroad. He has also authored 2 books, both of which, of course, are in my personal library. The first one is this. I'm sorry, it will be seen upside down or, because of the viewing. It's called Success from Being Mad, about the entrepreneurship of the veterans whom he has picked and chosen for their eccentricities and seen how they have made it in, the civilian world. The second book is Elephant of the High Himalayas, which I already said that he is an avid China watcher, and his thoughts and perspectives on the ongoing Indo-China imbroglio, as well as the background with a lot of research. Both books are fascinating reads, though I am from his battalion and I say so myself. Apart from this, because of his hands-on experience in Sri Lanka during the IPKF operations and his penchant for history, he's also a historian. He has been writing and delivering talks on the Sri Lankan war and throwing light in what is now being referred to by many as India's forgotten war. This was the profile. Now I'll take another minute or two to touch upon a little bit of what I know of Colonel Sidhu personally. He is an officer who believes in pushing himself beyond what he calls his comfort zone. This I had already noticed when he was commanding the battalion. And when I spoke to him a couple of days back and I asked Colonel Sidhu, so why do you insist on doing it even now? He had a very simple answer. He said, the moment you start being in your comfort zone and happy about it, you have imprisoned yourself and there dies your growth. But the point is that this thing, this belief of his is translated into dramatic action. And I'll just take a minute and tell you. Last year, I think it was a discussion was going on in the drawing room where his son-in-law was there, and they were planning to take a very, very arduous high altitude trek. Colonel Sidhu suddenly announced, being at that time about 65 years of age, that he would also be joining the trek. And according to Mr. Sidhu, whom I spoke to later, there was stunned silence. Because this trek has been classified as arduous even by hardened mountaineers. Now, for those of you who know the terrain, it was like this. They started off at Gangotri, went on to Kedartal, starting at 12,000 feet, then Patangani Dar, where he, unfurled the mechanized infantry flag. I'll show you a picture of it. And then they were supposed to go to Audenkol. They could not do it because of the very harsh weather conditions. And then back to Gangotri. The whole thing started at 12,000 feet, went up to about 16,500 feet for a period of about 8 days. So when he came back, and here is the picture of, I hope you can see it. That is Colonel Sidhu at 16,300 feet at Patangani Dar. When he came back and I asked him, sir, how was the experience? He had written something and I quote Colonel Sidhu. The horizon is wide, but the mind goes beyond. Gravity shackles the body, but never the mind. Give flight to the mind and the body goes along. So though it was tough, he said that it was worth it and he did it. And it does not stop there. I'll just take another 30 seconds. In the month of August, he has planned another 3,000-kilometer odyssey on motorcycles of 18 days in northern Ladakh. And this with 4 veterans, 2 of whom have not ridden a bike for 25 years. He also bought a 350cc Honda on which he is practicing. The route, for those who are familiar with Northern Command, Dehradun, Karu, Chushul, on to Daulak Beg Oldie, where he plans to wave the Indian flag in the face of the Chinese, then to the Karakoram Pass, Sasarla, Siachen Base Camp, and then back to Dehradun. He has written to the CDS, a copy to the Chief of Army Staff, who have passed on this letter to Northern Command, who for whatever reasons have not given permission till now. He says he's not going to take it lying down, and he will press on to ensure that he does this motorcycle trip. So this penchant of his to push himself and his body and mind beyond is what describes him now. And when I asked him again, what about this motorcycle odyssey? Again, I will quote him. He says, in the unexplored vistas, paths don't matter. The journey's end is the destination you reach. You have engraved your journey on the rocks of time.
Show this nicely.
So Colonel Sidhu sir wears many hats with equal ease and elan. A dedicating husband and a loving father, proud veteran, die-hard soldier, author, historian, a maverick, and last but not the least, a chaser of his own dreams. I present to you Colonel Rakesh Sidhu Sena Medal. Over to the host for further. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Sundar. I am surprised at the detail at which my life has been highlighted and spotlighted, though I am a very private person, but thank you nevertheless. So getting on to the topic at hand for the day, I wish to take off from the point where Colonel Sundar has spoken about Operation Pavan being a forgotten war. Having served there for 2.25 years, having seen people losing their lives, and even much more important, losing the use of their limbs, it saddens me that the nation can forget the sacrifices of 1,200 odd young men from the armed forces in a foreign country, where they had gone to ensure that the national interests of the country are secured even through violent means. I will come to this aspect later on also at the close of the subject, but having said this, I will start off on the aspects. First, I will be talking about the defining movements, because the operation had gone on for almost 2.25 years. I will just take the viewers through the defining movements of the Operation Pavan, and also simultaneously give a short overlay of what transpired, and then focus on some of the key aspects which will be able to better make you better understand as to what transpired and how the operation was conceived, and how it was conducted, and how it came to an end. And more important, and rather the most important, that the perpetrators of what happened, they coolly washed off their hands and kept the aspects of the failure of the operation into the hands of the IPKF. Here also, I would like to add that when we are going through the accord, which I will be taking you through, there it will be very crystal clear as to what was the accord, because ultimately the entire Operation Pavan has to be looked at from the prism of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, which was signed between India and Sri Lanka on 29th of July 1987. What was stated therein, because nobody can change that, what was achieved on the ground, and whether it was a failure or a success, I'll leave it to the judgment of the viewers before I proceed further on this aspect. The defining moments of Operation Pawan.
Why does it come up?
I just wish to utilize a line from my book, Elephant on the High Himalayas, that the battles of the mind are more difficult to win and have longer lasting impact than the physical war. When we are looking at the defining moments of Operation Pawan, what comes to the mind is that in June 1987, the formations had and the units had already started into the moving into the mounting bases. Whereas if you will see that it is 29th of July that the signing of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord occurred. And very surprisingly, it was by 30th of July 1987 that the induction had already started off. Now, this brings to mind very interesting aspects. The first aspect is that why were the troops already moving into the mounting bases in the month of June? So before getting into it, I'll just say that overall, when you look into the history of Sri Lanka, right till the early days, one of the most interesting and the curious aspect is that both the Sinhalas and the Tamils, who form part of the population of the modern day Sri Lanka, they have both migrated from India. The second aspect is, which is also very interesting, that though there is a religious divide within the country, both the religions, the Buddhism as well as the Hindu religion, which the Tamils follow, they also both take their origin from within the country, that is India. The third most interesting aspect which I find is that at the time when the intervention was taking place by India in Sri Lanka, the country per se had a very effective system of governance. It had effective security forces, law and order mechanism. And despite that, there was an ethnic problem. This ethnic problem arose because the Tamils, over a period of time, continued to stick to their origins, which was in the southern part of the country. Whereas the Sinhalas, they decided to carry on and establish their own culture, which was unique to them. And somehow or the other, the Sinhalas always felt that their culture is much more effective than the Tamil culture, or probably they were in awe that behind the Tamils, there were another a few million Tamils which were there in the hinterland of the country. So whatever may be the reason, there was this ethnic conflict which was taking place in the country. Over a period of time, the discrimination started off by the government and it was institutionalized, wherein the Sinhala was introduced as a language which ensured that the Tamils are not able to secure the jobs which they should be getting in the government, and so on and so forth. The representations by the government of India with the Sri Lankan government failed to sway the government of Sri Lanka, So it was left with no choice but to employ coercive means to ensure that the discrimination of the Tamils within Sri Lanka is done away with. One aspect of the balance aspect of the accord I will come to later. The second aspect is that when the signing of the accord was taking place on 29th of July 1987, there was the rifle butting of the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, by one of the ensigns of the Sri Lankan Navy who was presenting the Guard of Honor. Now, this is one incident which was projected all over, and it signifies the amount of opposition which was there amongst the Sinhala community to this accord, despite the government signing it. The 30th of July, when the induction was taking place, there is no way unless there is a military planning which is done in which has been done in advance, that an induction can take place so fast that on 29th of July you sign the accord and overnight the induction commences. This is also significant to the aspect that the Indian Army was already prepared for a military intervention, and it was only the signing of the accord which ensured that the Indian Army does not go into Sri Lanka against the government security forces, but goes as a friend. The next is that in the month of July and August, there were a general pause. There was an uncomfortable interaction between the security forces of Sri Lanka and the Indian Army. And then the situation deteriorated, and how the Indian Army was forced from a peacekeeping role to a peace enforcing role. It was in the month of October that the suicide by the 17 the LTT cadres who had been arrested by the Sri Lankan army and brought to the camp, which was taken as an excuse by the LTT to divest itself from supporting the accord and enter into a confrontation with the Indian military. This also I'll be covering it in detail in the subsequent aspect. And it followed by the reinforcing of the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka, which started off from the month of October when the initial operations were started against the Liberation Tiger of Tamil Elams. And this also is quite interesting because the way the reinforcement was conducted on the ground, this also indicates towards the effect that the Indian Army was not prepared for carrying out these operations at that point of time. Subsequently, when we come to the year 1988, one of the most defining moment of the year was the signing of the accord, or correction, it was the holding of the provincial elections. Because when we held the provincial elections in the month of December 88, and the IPK and the Tamil civil government came into power, this was one of the aspects which had been catered for in the accord.
So sorry for interrupting. Aren't you presenting, sir?
Yes, yes, yes. I'm going into that aspect also.
All right.
You see, the first part I have already this thing covered.
None of these.
In the second part, it is the peacekeeping to peace enforcement. This one I have already talked of. There was the town commandant, civil affairs, which was nominated in the month of November in the year 1987. Reinforcements I have talked of. Then the raising of the headquarters IPKF, which commenced in the month of October and September. And this is the holding of the provincial elections, which was there in 1988. The next aspect comes in the year of 1989, especially in the month of January, when Shri Premdasa became the president of Sri Lanka. Now, here I would like to highlight that even at the time of the signing of the accord, when Shri Jayawardene was the president of Sri Lanka, Shri Premdasa was one of the prominent critics of this accord. So when he took over as the president in the month of January 1989, this was the time when the Sri Lankan government actively started campaigning for the Indian peacekeeping force to leave Sri Lanka. And subsequently, in the month of July 1989, there were certain communal riots which took place in Samantarai, and these were also utilized as the basis for asking for the hastening of the withdrawal of the IPKF from Sri Lanka. And this is also the time when the conversations started taking place between the government of India through the High Commission in Colombo and the government of Sri Lanka about the withdrawal of the IPKF. And as consonance or fallout of these discussions, the ceasefire of the offensive operations against the LTT was commenced with effect from 1789. There is a misnomer that it was the arrival of the VP Singh government in the month of December, which ensured that the deinduction of the IPKF was ordered from Sri Lanka. I want to dispel this. You see, because when the ceasefire of offensive operations against the LTT took place, as shown in my previous slide, it was in the month of September. The deinduction of the southernmost force of the IPKF, which was the 24 Mountain Brigade from Kalmanai, it had already commenced. I happened to be at that point of time deployed in Kalmanai in this sector and acted as the rear guard along with my mechanized infantry company for this formation to fall back out of Sri Lanka. VP Singh became Prime Minister only in December, and the formal order to end the Operation Pavan in Sri Lanka was issued by them. By December, that is the time when the 57 Mountain Division was deinducted from Batiklova. It moved to Trincomalee and replaced the 4 Infantry Division there, which deinducted. And the final deinduction took place from Jaffna of 54 Infantry Division and 57 Mountain Division from Trincomalee. In the interim, after the 4 Infantry Division had moved out from Trincomalee, even 36 Infantry Division had moved out from Trincomalee. 4 Infantry Division, which was deployed in this thing, which was deployed, was also in the Vavuniya sector, was also moved out through Trincomalee. So with this, now I come to the aspect of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. Now, as far as the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord is concerned.
Are you sharing the screen?
Yes.
Because we cannot see this slides.
No, were you not able to see the slide last time,
we are
sir?
not seeing the slides. That's why I said.
Achha, okay, sir.
Just share the screen and on the slideshow so that.
I'll just get into it. Can you see it now, sir?
No.
Sir, could you click on share screen at the bottom?
Okay, just a minute.
Yes, sir.
You share screen and you Click on
Sorry,
the-
my apologies.
Is there a problem I can share from here?
No, no, sir, I'll just resolve this.
Perfect, sir.
Yeah, it's done. Perfect.
Okay, so I'll just the first part of the screen was the first slide was already seen by everybody when I had spoken about the mover formations of the units on formations to the mounting bases in June, to the signing of the Indus-Sri Lanka Accord, and subsequently the commencement of the induction on 30th of July, and the interim of the August, September. Then the peacekeeping to peace enforcement because of the suicide by the 17 LTT Tigers. This was on 5th of October 1987. After the peninsula had been cleared of the LTT Tigers overtly and they moved to the Wani jungles, the town commandant office was opened up, and Brigadier R.I.S. Kalo took over as the first town commandant. This was basically to ensure that the civil administration picks up in the Jaffna. Then October to 1987 to 1988, initially there was only 54 Infantry Division which had been inducted into the Jaffna Peninsula. It was followed by the induction of 36 Infantry Division into Trincomalee, followed by 4 Infantry Division into Vavonia, and 57 Mountain Division into the Batticaloa sector. And in the interim, in August, September 1987 itself, the headquarters IPKF was raised. November 1988 was the time when the Northeastern province elections were conducted. Also, the referendum was held for the integration of the northern and the eastern provinces. Mr. Prem Dasa became the president in January, and the communal riots started off in Samantarai, which were the basis for the starting of the talks between India and Sri Lanka, and the seizing of the offensive operations against the LTT in September. I have already explained about the 24 Mountain Brigade having moved out in the month of October, even before, whereas the VP Singh government took office in the month of December. And the 57 Mountain Division had already de-inducted to Trincomalee to replace the 36 Infantry Division there. And the final de-induction of the IPKF started off in March 1990. Now, after having spoken about this aspect, I will also be now getting on to the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. It is very essential for all of us to understand the wordings of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord and the key aspects which were mentioned therein. Whereas it is more than 2 pages or 3 pages document plus another 1 page of an annexure to it, there are certain aspects before I lead you through the key aspects of the accord. that this was one accord which neither the Sri Lankans wanted nor the LTT wanted, which was the main rebel group of the Tamil militants. It was the Indian government which was the most keen on the signing of this accord. And what happens? That we are the ones who were unable to ensure that our interests are guaranteed in this accord. It appears that there is some dichotomy in it, but it is not so. So when we discuss the accord per se, this aspect will be very clearly highlighted. There are senior officers who are from the Foreign Service also. There are senior officers who are from the Indian military also, and at the top levels who were involved in the Indian peacekeeping force operations, who claim that it was the best of the Indian Foreign Service who had negotiated this accord. I want to put it on record that if this record had been negotiated by the best of the Indian Foreign Service, then how is it that the baby was handed over to the Indian peacekeeping force on the ground? And was it the failure of the Indian peacekeeping force, or was it the failure of the political hierarchy and the Indian Foreign Service who had negotiated this accord, which brought about the situation which finally happened in the month of March 1990? So I will now get on to the next aspect, which is the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. So though it is not mentioned there that there are political aspects and there are military aspects, but for ease of understanding, I have divided them into two. The first is the political aspects. Now, another very interesting aspect of this accord is that it had very instantaneous timelines wherein the portions of the or the various aspects of the accords were required to be implemented. That also has got a history behind it, that the Indian and the Sri Lankan government were engaged with each other for a prolonged period of time, and the Sri Lankan government was recalcitrant. So finally, when they were coerced into the signing of this accord, it was with the premise that they should not be given any leeway to backtrack from it. And as a result of that, to ensure this does not happen, there were very instantaneous timelines. First is that the interim merger of the northern and the eastern provinces will take place within 3 months from the signing of the accord. The referendum, whether it needs to be regularized or not, will be held by 31st of December 1988 by the Sri Lankan government, in which by a simple majority, it will be decided whether the eastern province wants to merge with the northern province or not. And this referendum was to be conducted by the Sri Lankan government only in the eastern province. The second aspect is that the provincial council elections were required to be conducted by 31st of December 1987. It's another thing that because of the recalcitrant situation which occurred there, this got delayed by a year, and the elections were finally held in November, December 1988. Another key aspect was that there was a general amnesty to all the political prisoners and all the combatants who were taking part in the militant operations against the Sri Lankan government, that they will be given general amnesty by the president of Sri Lanka. There is the provision 2.9 which states about this. There is also the national language status which was to be given to the Tamils, because prior to this only the Sinhala language was given the national language status. And the expedition of the stateless Tamils and the refugees who had gone into Tamil Nadu in India, that was to be mutually expedited by the two governments. There were a few other minor aspects also, but these were the key aspects which need to be borne in mind when we are looking at the political aspects of this accord. Now, here itself, I will kill the aspect of the prism of the IP of operations overall and what was written into the political aspects of this accord. The interim merger of the northern and the eastern provinces within 3 months, it did take place. The referendum on the merger by 31st of December 1987 that went to November, December 1988, it did take place. And the referendum was a victory for the unification of the two provinces, which means that it was accorded. Here again, it's a different issue that subsequently in the year 2007, the Sri Lankan Supreme Court stepped in and declared this merger of the northern and the eastern provinces ultra vires of their constitution. So currently it is not there. The provincial council elections did take place and the civil government, which was dominated by the EPRLF and the ENTLF combined, they assumed power of the northern and the eastern provinces. A general amnesty to the political prisoners and the combatants was also granted. But here there will be certain aspects which when I talk about the suicide by the LTT cadres, that this aspect will come into play. The national language status to the Tamil language was accorded. And as far as the expedition of the process of repatriation of stateless Tamils and the refugees is concerned, that was an agreement which was to take place between the political components of the two governments. So when we look at the political aspects of the accord, almost all of them had been implemented, and it was the actions of the Indian peacekeeping force which ensured that the conditions were ripe for the holding of these elections, wherein despite the Liberation Tiger of Tamil Elams and the Janta Vimukta Peruna JVP, the militant organization of the Sinhalas, which was opposing the government, they both were against the holding of these elections, tried their level best, but could not able to influence it, and this was successfully held. After this, we come on to the military aspects of the accord. Now, you see, look at the timelines. The cessation of hostilities had to take place within 48 hours of signing of the accord. That is between the Tamil militants and the Sri Lankan army. The surrender of weapons by the militants, please mark this, is to take place within 48 hours of the seizure of, starting from 48 hours of the seizure of the hostilities to 72 hours. The Sri Lankan army in the northeastern provinces will be confined to barracks after the surrender of these weapons by the Tamil militant groups. Here again, there was a proviso that the nominated authority and to whom the weapons will be surrendered will be nominated by the president of Sri Lanka, and there will be reps of the Red Cross Society of Sri Lanka and the Red Cross Society of India, who will be present at that point of time to act as independent monitors of the actions which are taking place. Ipso facto, India was made to be the guarantor for the accord, that is for the actions of both the Sri Lankan armed forces or the Sri Lankan government, that is for the political aspects, as well as for the actions of the LTTE. So the moment this takes place, this has ensured that the Sri Lankan government acknowledged that there were special security interests of India, which they accepted. So after going through these key aspects of the military and the political, I will now get down to a critique of the accord. That is the basic tenets of the accord. The accord guaranteed this unity and the sovereignty of Sri Lanka, which implied that whatever is the settlement which takes place will take place within the confines of the Constitution of Sri Lanka. And in case there is an amendment required to be, it will be a legal process. The merger of the northern and the eastern provinces and the creation of the provincial assemblies, this had to be done through a amendment of the Sri Lankan constitution, which was done by the government of Sri Lanka. The accord also accepted by the fact when they said that the northern and the eastern provinces will be merged together, that there are special interests of the Tamil minority onto these two territories where they were in a majority. And the fact that the Sri Lankan government accepted that they will end the discrimination against the Tamil minorities, it legitimized the grievances of the Tamil militants, which earlier on the Sri Lankan government was not willing to accept and stated that there was no discrimination against them. So willy-nilly, the accord still stands, and it is an international accord, and it gives an opportunity to the Tamil minority, even at this point of time, under the aegis of this accord, to approach the international agencies in case this the grievances against the Tamils are not resolved. The Sri Lankan government was committed to resolve the grievances of the Tamils. The talk about devolving upon India the role of guarantor and ipso facto regarding recognizing its special security interests in the region, I have already highlighted. There was one major lacuna in this accord, which ensured that the Indian interests were not looked after. And that was that the entry of the Indian peacekeeping force into Sri Lanka was made incumbent on receiving an invitation from the Sri Lankan government. Ipso facto, this implies that in case they withdraw that request, the Indian peacekeeping force has got no locus standi to continue to remain within the country. This is the aspect which says that the interests of national interests of the Indian government were compromised while signing of this accord took place. Another key aspect was that there was no political consensus as far as signing of this accord was concerned. The opposition parties were all opposed to any military intervention. So when the VP Singh government came into power, or when it became this thing clearer that the Rajiv Gandhi government may not come into power the next time, the opposition to the accord started within the country drastically. The Sri Lankans and the LTT were not keen on the accord. The way the operations of the IPKF were converted from a military operation to a peacekeeping operation overnight left no time for the Indian armed forces which were to be launched for the operations to carry out any briefings, etc. So these are the major aspects as far as the Sri Lankan accord is concerned. After this, then we come on to the challenges of the IPKF. You see, the Indian peacekeeping force, when it was inducted into the island, prior to that, all the preparations which were being conducted, they were for a opposed induction into Sri Lanka to ensure that the victimization of the Tamil minority in the Sri Lankan government stops. There was an escalation curve. The political dialogues were carrying on, and the aspect of this political dialogue were carrying on for quite a period of time is also mentioned, it is also attributed within the accord, wherein they say that the exchange of letters which had taken place for the 6 months from July 1986 to December 1987, and the decisions which were taken thereon will also be construed to be part of this accord. So after this, there is a long pause of around 6 months or 7 months when the accord is signed. The exchange stopped, or at least whatever is mentioned in the accord in the month of December 1986. In 1987 July, when it was imminent that India is going to intervene militarily, was the time when the accord was signed. So there is the interim period of 7 months before it could be progressed much further. Now, for the induction of the Indian military for carrying out offensive operations, it was inducted into 4 mounting bases. There was a mounting base in Vizag, in Chennai, in Secunderabad, in Agra. So you have to look at it from the point of view that when the Indian military is poised for operations, suddenly the accord is signed on 29th of July in the morning, and by evening, the Indian army is told to go in, but now as a part of the Indian peacekeeping force. So it totally converts the entire aim, the briefing, and the actions which were required to be carried out. The Indian army was not even aware at that point of time what were the terms and conditions of the accord. It was only faxed to them or emailed to them or whatever it was that this is what has been signed, and it was left for them or the hierarchy, military hierarchy on the ground, that is the 54 Infantry Division, to interpret it at this point of time. That takes time. For it to be passed down to the formations and the units, and for the troops and the officers to be briefed on it, takes even further time. This problem was further confounded by the separation, physical, geospatial separation of these 4 mounting bases. The attitude of the Sri Lankan army, what it is going to be towards the peacekeeping force when it is entering, especially because of the rifle butting of the Indian Prime Minister, it was all uncertain. Even the formations and units which were going into Sri Lanka, they were all part of offensive formations, the strike corps of the Indian Army or the reserves. They were not trained for carrying out any peacekeeping operations or subsequently anti-militancy operations. So these were the challenges which the IPKF faced prior to induction. There were no maps, there were no briefings. So all these aspects were a big issue. So when the induction commenced, the 54 Infantry Division with a mechanized infantry battalion, so the division less a brigade moved into Jaffna through amphibious operations, as well as by air landing at Palali and KKS jetty. The 3rd Brigade with another Mac company was transported amphibiously to Trincomalee, and from there they moved down to Batikloa. These were all aspects which took place at that point of time in a very uncertain environment. I mean, I'm just narrating my incident, that how I got inducted into Sri Lanka. There was induction had commenced on 30th of August, on 30th of July. By 31st of July itself, there was a dichotomy about the reactions of the Sri Lankan army. And it is evidenced by the aspect that an airborne operation had to be planned to coerce them from not following that route. Me and a small subunit of mine were part of that. We were already mid airborne when this operation was cancelled, because the Sri Lankan army realized that the Indian government means business. And so they decided not to interfere with the operations of the Indian peacekeeping force. The fighting troops, after they were inducted, were confined to camps. There was no maps, etc. So for these 2 months which were there, this was a big issue. that had the Indian peacekeeping force fighting units and the troops being permitted to carry out recce, the knowledge of the terrain and all these aspects would have been very clear. At the time of induction, when we were moving in from Trincomalee to Batiklova or within Jaffna, from Palali and KKS, there was mass welcome of the Indian peacekeeping force. The civil population was much relieved. It was taking us around 1 to 2 hours to move just 1 kilometer. This all impacted the troops psychologically. Why I'm harping on this aspect or stressing on this aspect at this time is that it was because of this that when the orders came in again very suddenly, that you have to now commence operations against the Tamil militants, it was psychologically a very difficult aspect for the troops to switch over overnight. The first thing which came about was again, like at the time when the Sri Lankan army and the government wanted the IPKF to withdraw, there were riots which were generated in Samantharai. Similarly, in the month of August, there were riots which started off ethnic riots in Trincomalee. Now, Trincomalee has got a population of say 1/3 Tamils who are Hindus, 1/3 Tamils who are Muslims, and 1/3 Sinhalas. So the Sri Lankan government ordered the army to send in reinforcements into Trincomalee. This was against the terms and conditions of the IPKF Accord because by this point of time, the Sri Lankan army had already been confined to the barracks in the northern and the eastern provinces. So when this thing came about, the Indian army, this thing took actions which were determined without ensuring that there is no diplomatic fallout, that the reinforcing troops, which were this thing Unit Plus, which were coming into IPK, into Trincomalee, they were blocked from entry. And this determined action also subsequently ensured that it gave warning to the Sri Lankan army and the government that we mean business. And for the next 1 year or so, there was no interference from them as far as the operations of the Indian army was concerned. Another aspect which we have to see is that the weapons which were required to be surrendered within 48 hours plus 72 hours, very minuscule weapons were surrendered by them even by the month of September. So this indicated that the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, which was the main Tamil militant group, it was not very keen in ensuring that the accord succeeds. It had no faith in the intentions of the Sri Lankan army. The aspect of their being involved in fratricidal conflict with the other Tamil militant groups is also very evident, wherein a majority of the Tamil militant groups, including the top hierarchy, were massacred and annihilated by assassinations by the Liberation Tiger of Tamil Eelams. Mahathir, who was their military leader, Velu Pillai Prabhakaran, who was their supreme leader, as well as Anton Balasingham, who was their political ideologue. They were all very clear about one aspect, that they should be the only sole legitimate organization which should be anointed for voicing the opinion of the Tamil population at large. The aspect of entering into a democratic polity where they will have to stand for elections and so forth was not part of their political ideology at all. It was an anathema to them. They believed in a totalitarian rule. So now I come to the aspect of the peacekeeping to peace enforcement. On 2nd of October 1987, the self-appointed Lieutenant Colonel Kumaran and the second officer of theirs, who were from Trincomalee and Batiklova region of the Pulendran of the LTT, They were caught while smuggling in weapons and ammunition from the Tamil Nadu coast to the coast of Sri Lanka in the waters, territorial waters of the Sri Lankan nation. These 17 LTT cadres, they were brought to the Palali Air Base, and from there they were required to be shifted to Colombo. The LTT leadership appealed to the Indian government that they have got general amnesty and they cannot, and the Sri Lankan security forces cannot arrest their personnel, and hence the Indian army should intervene to ensure that they are released. And they quoted the Accord para 2.11 for this. Whereas the Sri Lankan army's point of view was that as per the terms of the para 2.9 of the same accord, all the militants were supposed to surrender their arms within 48 plus 72 hours, and carrying out such activity even at this point of time is against the terms and conditions of the accord, and hence they are common criminals and have to be dealt with under the provisions of the Sri Lankan criminal law. The matter being sensitive enough was referred by 54 Division to the hierarchy, and till the time this orders for taking action either way were to be received, the IPKF ensured that the Sri Lankan army is not able to shift these prisoners from there by throwing a cordon around the place where they were held in confinement under Sri Lankan custody. Subsequently, there were instructions from the higher up that these LTT cadres are not to be dealt with by us and will be dealt with by the Indian army. The cadre was withdrawn, and when the cadre was withdrawn, these 17 LTT cadres, they consumed cyanide, which they were carrying with them, and 12 of them died, 5 were resuscitated, this thing in the Sri Lankan hospital, whose services are utilized under the supervision of the Indian field ambulance doctors who were present there. There is a very interesting take on this also by one of the surviving officers who was involved in this cordon along this is Major Emil Uban from the mechanized infantry, and also the perspective of the div headquarters, which was given by Lieutenant Colonel S.K. Handa, who was the officiating ADMS of 54 Infantry Division, and who was tasked to cater for this medical emergency of the LTT cadres consuming cyanide and to take preventive actions, not preventive, post actions for resuscitating them. So this, when this was used as a pretext to move out from the accord, it had nothing to do with the Indian army or the Indian peacekeeping force failing to appoint, to conduct the responsibilities which were assigned to them. They did what was the directions of the political hierarchy, and the fallout of that has to be put at the footstep of the political hierarchy or the security establishment in Delhi who were handling this case. Another interesting aspect where the heliborne operations were conducted by in Jaffna University by the Indian peacekeeping force was from 10 to 13th October 1987. For this also, the Indian peacekeeping force is much vilified. But we can say that at the point of time when the terrain knowledge was not clear, the capabilities of the military capabilities, there was very minimal inputs on these LTT military capabilities and the intelligence inputs that they had been able to penetrate the radio nets of the Indian peacekeeping force. There was distinct evidence that the planning of this operation was of prior knowledge to the LTT, and they conducted and deployed their troops accordingly. So when the Indian peacekeeping force sent in a team of para commandos, approximately 100 odd, and an infantry company from the Siklai, which was to be heli-landed there for the securing the helipad, and balance of the Siklai battalion was to move in on a ground to link up with them. Because of the offensive actions, that is the firing on the helicopters, only the Paras SF team and the leading platoon, that is the advance party of the company, were able to be heli-dropped at the airfield at the Jaffna University grounds. And because of the damage which had been inflicted onto the helicopters, they were not able to bring in the subsequent reinforcements. The para-commandos were required to conduct a specialized task for which they moved out, but because of the fire were pinned up in a built-up area which was in the near vicinity of the helipad. The communications between the 13th Siklai platoon, which was there at the helipad, and the IPKF headquarters of 54 Infantry Division were disrupted because of the loss of the radio communication, which was held by this platoon, which was led incidentally by their company commander, Major Virender Singh. The company which was the platoon which was there on the ground, they exhausted their ammunition supply by next day and were annihilated by the LTT, whereas the SF team, which was were in some of the built-up accommodation in the close vicinity because of the fire, could not interfere with the operations of which were being conducted by the LTT against this, but they were able to fend for themselves and ensure that they do not suffer too many casualties. Next day, there was a operation launched for the extrication of this force, and they were able to link up with them on the ground, which was also comprised of the 13 Siklai, less 2 companies. There was a team of the Para SF led by the commanding officer of the Paras, and there were a troop of tanks which had been formed part of this force, and they were able to bring this force up. Here again, so we have to look at it that whatever had been conceived and planned because of faulty intelligence inputs, the operation could not be conducted on the ground as it was conceived, and it resulted in casualties as far as the Indian peacekeeping force troops are there on the ground. So I'll be quickly going through over the other aspects of the Indian peacekeeping force operations, and then whatever are the additional questions on any of these aspects, I'll take it on during the audience interaction aspect. So when we are summing up the operations of the Indian peacekeeping force, the accord had weak foundations. We have already spoken of that. The contingency of the Sri Lanka and the LTT reneging on the accord was never this thing taken into consideration by the planners, this thing in New Delhi and in Colombo. When the balloon went up in the month of October and the Indian peacekeeping force commenced operations against the LTT, there was helter-skelter move-in of troops, which ensured that it was not as part of any previous planning. So there were formations which came in. They had units placed under command of a different formation. There were units which came in. 2 companies are landing up in a different sector. Another 2 companies are landing up in a different sector. The units are being launched into operations within not within 12 hours of their arriving in Sri Lanka. So these are all aspects which indicates that there was not due thought given to what could happen if the Sri Lankan army or the LTTE reneges from this accord. So when we say that the Indian peacekeeping force had already conducted whatever it was required to do as far as the political conditions of the accord are concerned by the December 1988, when the northeastern provinces had been merged, the referendum had been carried out, the general elections had been conducted, the civilian government had taken this charge of the northern and the eastern provinces. As far as the IPKF mandated duties were concerned, they were more or less complete. Prolonging the stay of the IPKF beyond that is also looked at by Lieutenant General Kalkat, who in one of his recent articles states that he was ordered by New Delhi to continue to remain with the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka to ensure that the northeastern province civil government of the Tamils, it is able to generate roots. To generate strong roots takes time. It's not a process which can take place overnight. I am aware of plans which were instituted to ensure that these roots take place. Actions were on hand. However, it was the premature withdrawal of the IPKF which ensured that the roots of this civil government in northern and the eastern provinces continued to remain weak. What happened? When the IPKF was withdrawn from the island, and this was a political decision. You see, if the Sri Lankan government has not fulfilled its part of the political mandate, which was mentioned into the accord, it was well within the rights of the Indian government to ensure that the IPKF will not move out from there, because the Indian peacekeeping force and the Indian government were mandated and were the guarantors of not only of the actions of the militants, but also of the actions of the Sri Lankan government. However, it was a political decision. They decided that the IPKF has to move out. And once the IPKF moved out, then there was no decisive influence which the Indian government could exercise in Sri Lanka. As a result of which, it was in 2007, the Sri Lankan Supreme Court annulled the integration of these two provinces. The fiscal powers for the provincial governments were not given so that they could act in the way they want to. And today we have a spectacle wherein
I just came. There was a packet. Don't trouble me.
and today there is a spectacle.
Please mute.
Just ask him.
Today
अभी
there
अभी
is a
मरना
spectacle.
है क्या?
Hey, somebody else is speaking. Please mute only the speaker to speak, please.
And today there is a spectacle where the very basis of the accord are being questioned in Sri Lanka. The Chinese have this thing coming in and intervening, and the Indian government is unable to carry out any effective intervention as on date. Those 6 months of papers which were exchanged between the Indian government and the Sri Lankan government, they talked about the the hiring out of the radio communications aspects, of the international media to Voice of America. They talked about the Trincomalee oil storage farms not being made available to a foreign country. They talked about the foreign military advisors and military support not to be taken by the Sri Lankan government, which is to the detriment of the interest of India. And what is happening today? That the Indian infrastructure development has been muscled out by the Chinese government, and the Chinese are having a dominating say in the affairs in Sri Lanka, as also in Nepal. And the Indian government is not able to carry out any effective response towards it. So this is how the the withdrawal of the IPKF is impacting the actions of our country and affecting our security interests even to this day. With this, I have come to the end of whatever I had to talk about, and I would be more than happy to take on any questions or observations from the audience.
Thank you very much, Colonel Sidhu, for that absolutely analytical talk. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions. Any questions you have, please ask. The speaker will be happy to answer. You can unmute yourself and shoot your questions.
Can I come in, Colonel Sidhu, please?
Yeah, please.
Please.
Though I am too small amount to question Colonel Sidhu, who is the great historian and the veteran of Kargil and IPKF. So I'll not ask question. I'll just rattle out a few points which is pricking me. Like
Okay.
when Sri Lanka got its freedom in 1950, the difference between Sinhala and Tamil were there already. By 1970, when it came, this differences were visible. One could see there is a division between Sinhala and this Tamilian. By 1980, this Tamilian group started regrouping themselves and to take on the Sinhala armies. And it is like one cannot say we were not aware because this Tamilians, including Prabhakaran, was operating from our Madras, now Chennai, and he was arrested in 1982. So we were in know of things what this Tamilian groups are up to. Thereafter, from 84, 85 onwards, it was all we will go into Sri Lanka. First, my question is that did we prepare ourselves in those let's say 15, 16 years before getting inducted? Number two, could we have delayed this induction of IPKF when Pakistan, China and Singapore was more than eager to help out Sri Lanka? Number three, it is just to give you example, in 1971, Pakistan had their general election and this Western Pakistan party lost. But that time this RAW was born, which was just 3 years. But effectively we engaged our RAW agents there and we could get the actionable intelligence. In 1987, what I feel, politics failed, diplomacy failed, and intelligence was just what you call it as just an eyewash. Ultimate sufferer was the Indian Army, which lost 1100 plus soldiers. Then my question is why we have jumped so early for induction, and why we have jumped so early for de-induction, which took another 16 years, 2066 to 2009, to eliminate the LTT. Colonel Sidhu, sir.
Oh, thank you, sir. So, as far as the history is concerned of the animosity between the Tamils and the Sinhalas, you are dot on. I did not want to cover that aspect in detail for the simple reason that the time did not permit for me to look at it in a greater detail. So you are absolutely right as far as the grievances between both the communities are concerned. And though in my preview, I did mention that there was ethnic conflict going on despite effective governance system and an effective security system. But keeping that aside, the first aspect is that as far as the awareness of the Tamil militants operating from Tamil Nadu in using Tamil Nadu as a support base for operating in Jaffna and Patiklova, as also our awareness and support to them is also undeniable. And the aspect is that when the decision was taken that we have to move in this thing into Sri Lanka, it is not over now. Being part of a unit and a formation which had been mobilized multifarious points of time prior to 1987 also. So I can say with conviction that the Indian government tried to utilize coercive means diplomatically only to ensure that the Sri Lankan government agrees to ameliorate the conditions of the Tamils. This had started off
Please.
from 85, 86, 87, when portions of the Indian offensive formations were mobilized for these tasks, but were not moved out from their bases into the mounting bases, but it is there. Also, when we are looking at this accord, I have been saying quite clearly about it, that the accord per se has got a provision which talks that the letters which have been exchanged between the Indian and the Sri Lankan government between June 1986 to December 1986 is recorded there, which means that there is a political discussion which is taking place. Then there is a pause of around 6 months before it is again taking place. The Sri Lankan government is not bending to the requirements which are being addressed, which are wanting to be addressed by the Indian government. And hence, the decision to carry out coercive action started in the month of June. And so there is a layered intervention which is taking place. That first is the attempt to go through the diplomatic channel. When that is not fructifying, then we are taking the military channel. When the Sri Lankan government accepts that, okay, fine, it is going to go in for an accord, then there is a changeover of aims, and we decide that the accord is to be implemented under the aegis of the of an Indian peacekeeping force. Now, having a peacekeeping force in a country which has got its own governance structure, which is effective, which has got its own security forces, which is effective, but it was impacting the political situation in the country also. The Tamil Nadu has got a vast percentage of Tamils within the country, and they have got kith and kin relations with the Tamils in Jaffna and in Batticaloa. So there was tremendous political pressure also on the Indian government to ensure that we intervene to say that the oppression of the Tamils stops. So it is no way that it was a decision which was taken all of a sudden. What I'm saying is that the decision to employ the Indian army for intervening militarily, it's that was conveyed at the last possible time, because the Indian government also was not clear whether it will be signed or not. I am also saying that even when the accord had been signed on 29th of July, induction commenced the same night, and troops started landing on 30th of July in Palali and in KK at KK's jetty. The Sri Lankan army was still in a dilemma whether it should be opposing or not. The inputs of the Colombo High Commission to the government was what influenced the Indian government to order the launch of an airborne operation, which again got called off midair, literally midair, because the Sri Lankan army then decided finally, under the tutelage of their government, not to carry out any offensive actions which may interfere with the induction of the Indian peacekeeping force. Am I clear on this aspect, sir? Does it answer your queries?
Yeah, Colonel Sidhu, I have political decisions apart,
Sir,
all coming to a brass tacks. Calling
Sir.
a spade, would you
Sir.
say that the main element guilty in this was the army headquarters? They had no business to accept it. They had to stand their ground and say, you cannot launch an operation without proper planning and intelligence. Wasn't the army headquarters guilty of this?
Sir, as a officer who took part in the operations on the ground, plus holding certain appointment for a short duration of time during the initial phase of the operations. I am aware of certain aspects of what were taking place. The the decisions of the IPKF for the intervention in Sri Lanka was a big mix of personal equations. It was the ultimate decisions were being taken by the PMO Secretariat. The MEA was being influenced by Shri Mani Dixit, who was their pointsman in Sri Lanka. The the Defense Ministry was being influenced by the Chief of Army Staff, General J. Sundarji, who had his own views as to what the operation should be about. So when the political hierarchy is giving instruction that this operation has to be conducted, there is very little which the chief at that point of time can go and say ki I cannot conduct it, especially when there is an accord which has been signed. It is an international accord. That accord states that the Indian peacekeeping force should move in at so and so point of time. It will monitor the surrender of weapons. It will guarantee the actions of the Sri Lankan government and per se their army and the LTTE. If the Indian the chief of the army staff at that point of time says no, I am not ready, it is likely to be a huge diplomatic embarrassment also for the Indian government on the international arena. And it may possibly have detracted from the impact which the Indian government wanted to carry out by sending and the launching of the IPKF. This is a decision which you and me are not qualified to take at this point of time, even with hindsight. That is what my take on this is.
Yeah, I mean, what I would submit is when, there was political pressure in 1971 and with a huge refugee crisis going on, General Manekshaw was able to stand up and say that if I had to go in, I can guarantee you defeat. And ultimately, the government had to yield to the army's way of thinking. So couldn't it have been projected that way? I mean, it is incumbent on the top military leadership to do that.
Sir,
That did not happen.
Sir, you are right. But you have to look at it that every situation is different. In 1971, the Indian military leadership was taken into confidence before the launching of the operation.
Yeah.
Here, the Indian military is not taken into confidence during the conduct of the diplomatic discussions. It is given a fait accompli. The accord is signed. Please move in. I mean, there is a very glaring difference between 1971 and in 1987. That the Indian military is being asked to carry out an operation in support of an international agreement which has been signed by the Indian government, which the Indian army and the Indian military leadership is totally unaware of. What is it? What has been mentioned in it? It is just getting us fax or a copy of the agreement. Here it is, and please go in. It's a different matter that the Indian army was prepared for a military interventions. But a military intervention is a totally different ball game for carrying out a peacekeeping operation in a foreign countries.
Right. It was mostly expected as a peacekeeping operation. Ultimately, it turned out to be a war.
So there has been fault, but who is at fault is to be looked at. Is it the foreign policy establishment? Is it the PMO? Is it the political leadership? Or it is a combination of all, including the military leadership?
I was only taking the military part of it. I guess they were told to go in for a peacekeeping operation which turned into a war. Yes, that's it.
Sidhu, can I make a request?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please, sir, please.
Yes, sir, please.
I was just wondering that I've heard military officers and military perspective being projected on the Sri Lanka operations. Has there been ever, have you heard any diplomat or any other official from the government of India making similar presentations as to what happened in Sri Lanka. And we are, of course, as a good military officer, we are justifying whatever we did. We're not saying that we have not delivered the goods, etc., etc. But are there anybody from their side who made a similar presentation? Have you heard it?
Oh, sir, I'll just answer this question of yours with a very clear aspect. There is a group of officers, young officers at the point of time who were involved in Sri Lanka, and now they're all veterans. And they have grouped together into a group which is known as the Emerald Islands. They have decided that this aspect of the Indian peacekeeping operations being forgotten and being brushed under the carpet, not only by the military leadership of the day, but also by the political leadership and the security hierarchy, has to be addressed. The legacy of the 1,200 odd brave soldiers who made the supreme sacrifice for the nation cause has to be brought to the fore. So today only, when there was a discussion going on with it, I am forgetting the name of the officer, I cannot recall it at instant point of time. He says that after every conduct of every military operation, there is a review of the military ops. And we as an army learn lessons from it. Whether they are implemented or not subsequently is a different issue. However, in most of these cases, whether it is the 1971 war, it is the 1965 war, where the prisoners and the territories were exchanged without ensuring that there is a agreement which is signed, which is to the interest of the country at large, or even in Sri Lanka, it is always the political decision making which is at fault, and there is no political review of the political interactions or the dynamics which ensured that this action takes place. So what happens? That we as a country, time and again, repeat the same political or geopolitical mistakes which have occurred earlier. Military is then thereafter utilized to somehow extricate the chestnuts of the country from the burning fire. The same thing happened in Ladakh last year.
It has been happening in 62 also.
It's been happening time and again.
Is still not out.
Yeah.
It's been happening time and again. So there is a need to have a overarching body which should be having constitutional dimensionals, which should form the basis for taking geopolitical decisions for conducting any out of area military operations.
Yeah, as you said, a debriefing kind of thing after every operation.
Sir,
In other words, you have not heard any politician stroke diplomat or a government official taking the stage like you have done to project their side of the story. I wanted to know whether they will palm off all the responsibilities to the army, saying that they goofed up, or they have done a damn good job.
So what happens is that the interactions of the political hierarchy as well as the bureaucracy are always closed. It'll either be in the form of a book for which you cannot interact directly with whatever is written in it, excepting for writing your review on that, which may not be looked at or be given due attention. Or it is in the form of a closed door interaction in which there is no audience participation. Today, this is one of the clear examples where an hour has been devoted to the talk and more than half an hour has been devoted for audience interaction. We have nothing to hide. We have got the answers which the queries are likely to come up from the audience, and we are willing to answer them. I wish that the political hierarchy and the bureaucracy, which is responsible for these snafus, are able to give all of us, the citizens of the country, an opportunity to question them on these aspects.
May I be permitted to say something?
Please, sir. Please, sir.
Yeah, I am Arjun Mutana, Major General Arjun Mutana, I am from the Garhwal Rifles. I was a company commander with 18 Garhwal in Jaffna. I entered into Sri Lanka a little later after the initial assault, if I can use that word, into Jaffna town, to capture Jaffna town. I had the privilege of, being in Jaffna and thereby getting to interact with a lot of Tamils, educated Tamils, people who were part of the Sri Lankan Administrative Service. I got an opportunity to read a wonderful book by the Jaffna University team entitled The Broken Palmyra, which, listed out the entire sequence of events of how the loss of trust between the Tamils and the Sinhalas took place, how the LTT rose, what all happened. Anyway, that's a very long book. To my understanding, this whole issue of IPKF being deployed and everything else was by the force of three very strong individuals: Rajiv Gandhi, General Sundarji, and Mr. Dikshit. I don't know where the raw was in this whole story, but we always heard stories that IPKF had surrounded LTT leadership, and then the raw told them pull back because we are going to force them to come to terms with us. These three people on the Indian side literally rammed through the agreement. They also rammed through the military operations.
Sir, may I interrupt for just for 30 seconds, sir? You talk about the raw. There was a talk which was conducted by us veterans under the aegis of one of the other groups like the Colors of Glory, where now Colonel Manoj Chanan, who is from 65 Armored Regiment, and he was also participated in Operation Pavan. He had talked of the intelligence aspects of the IPKF. So, and he had inputs from Colonel Nair and the other officers who were of the Int Corps, who were actively involved on these aspects. So the PMO Secretariat was being given inputs and being assigned directions directly from the PMO from the PMO office. And there was a joint secretary there who used to interact with the RAW, get those inputs, get political approvals, and ensure political decisions are done. So this is how the RAW was also able to provide its input. Sorry, sir, for interruption.
Oh, no, it's your talk. So it's perfectly all right. One sec. Hey.
So may I have a question, sir?
Please.
Just a short question.
Yeah.
Where did the funding for the LTT, because massive amount of funding would have been required for them to run this whole operation, sir?
Yes,
Any
yes.
idea where this funding came from, sir?
Yes. They had three sources of fundings. One was contribution from the Tamil diaspora. Some part of that was also from Tamil Nadu. The second was from gun running, and the third was from the psychotropic substances trade.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
No, about the contributions and their collection, they were very, very clear about how they collected money. They went around the entire locals, I mean, the natives of Sri Lanka. And I have met families who have contributed their entire gold collection. There were huge amounts of money that were collected by LTT. And that is how they made sure that they were the only, as Colonel Sidhu had mentioned, they eliminated all the other groups because there was a splitting of the funds that were being collected. So when a person, LTT collector went to a person's house, they got huge amounts of gold, and that was tremendous. And of course, they compounded that by gun running. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Indian RAW was funding them tremendously, because it is open knowledge that Indian RAW taught them how to set off these IEDs. Entire training to them was given in our camps, in the Tutu camps. I mean, the establishment Tutu camps. All of them were underwent training. That is where they learned how to prepare and set off IEDs. And then they converted that into suicide attacks, which they were, I think, the leading proponents of suicide attacks.
Sir,
the issue, yeah, sorry.
RAW can be blamed for most of the ills, excepting providing monetary resources.
It's almost an open secret. Our own army trained them. Ultimately, they turned
So
against us.
their
No, we were.
maximum percentage-wise, their maximum financiers came in from the drugs and the guns trade.
Yeah, I mean, we were shooting people in Sri Lanka, in Jaffna, for putting up posters. And when we landed in Tambaram, we saw the same posters. Entire Tambaram city was, Tambaram and Madras city was plastered with the same posters for which we were shooting
Yeah.
people in Jaffna. I think the other factor was what Colonel Sidhu did mention was actually the impact of the two political parties of Tamil Nadu, the type of pressure that they brought to bear upon the Indian government. Initially, when in 1987, the Indian government possibly brushed aside those concerns. But by 88, 89, by the time the VP Singh government came into power, those pressures became considerable. I'd like to make one last point. Sorry if I may, Colonel Sidhu.
So please.
18 Gadwal, I joined them later, only got deployed into Sri Lanka with them. But in the month of June and July 1987, they had Tamil interpreters embedded with them. They had entire preparation for embodiment and out of country deployment. It is only when the peace accord got signed and the peacekeeping force went in, when all these these units from 36 Div in Gwalior were stood down. And then suddenly when the balloon went up in October, the units were all again rushed into Sri Lanka. Just one last point, if I have the time, if I might. Is the role of the military leaders at the local level. When I say local level, the divisional commanders, brigade commanders. We actually saw that my own unit, 18 Gadwal, was split in the air. CO and one party landed in Patiklova, and the remaining unit landed in Jaffna. Then there was a big drama about how they were again brought together. The local commanders, no politician was telling them how to deploy. No politician was telling them how to use their forces. There was a definite lack of leadership and calmness. And I regret to say that I saw this again in Kargil. We were in a neighboring formation. In that time, I was commanding a unit. Till General Mohinder Puri landed up in Dras and, organized the entire operations in the Dras sector, there was the same drama going on. Units were being rushed into operations without proper pause. It was only General Mohinder Puri who came in, calmed things down, and thereafter we only saw success. Sri Lanka, the same thing happened initially. I am privy to a conversation where a staff officer saw General, I think General Puri, if I'm right, no, not General Puri, Harkirat Singh, who was literally bundled off from 54 Div to Delhi, and the deputy GOC was there. My own CO walked in and he was told, meet the GOC. He was walking towards General Harkirat and he was told, sorry, please go to officiating GOC. There was the deputy GOC, and he moved in there to receive his orders. It was a force of overwhelming personalities and their coitere, if I can say that. You had General Sundarji issuing orders to Brigadier Manjeet Singh, who went on to be awarded the Mahavir Chakra, that get into Jaffna by so and so time. What are there? They're just a set of piddly terrorists. You can brush them aside. So there are, at the local level, military decisions definitely were taken in haste and not well thought out. But again, thanks to the force of personalities at that time. Thank you very much.
Sir, you made some very valid observations, and also that though we carried out dissection of the operations and the failings and the strong points of the Operation Pavan, they were not implemented at the during even the Kargil war. The reason is that the failings which were there at the higher levels were also the failings which were there in the higher levels in Operation Pavan. They were political, they were military, and removal of some of the military commanders, this thing was there because the operations were not moving as planned. But here again, we cannot use a broad brush to tar the entire military leadership. I am well aware of the military leaders, especially at the brigade commanders and the COs level, some of them who did exceptionally well, even during the month of October. And being part of a distinct force, not all fingers are the same. I will leave it at that, sir.
Any more questions, gentlemen? I think Wing Commander Ravi Mani was raising his hand. Where is Ravi? You have a question?
Sir, just 30 seconds, if I may, if it's not too long, Captain Ramchandran, sir.
Yeah, just a second. If Ravi
Muthanna-
Mani had this question or is out.
No
Okay,
question,
Sundar, go ahead. Go
Mr.
ahead. sir.
Muthanna just said a very interesting point about this establishment 2-2's role. Now I was with them, but I will not say anything more because day before yesterday on a lighter vein, there was an article in the paper which said that your pension can be stopped in case you make any disclosures and you've been serving in these organizations. But therefore, I will not comment more on it. But I did serve with the establishment 2-2 and in the critical period. And there is a lot to what General Muthanna had said. I will leave it at that, sir.
You're not drawing a pension like me. There's nothing to be afraid.
By the way, the military hierarchy is not part of this. It is all for those who are under the civil pensionary rules, though we may be brought in subsequently in case we criticize too much.
No, we are not criticizing. We are analyzing. You know, so
Yeah,
many
very
years
true,
have
sir.
passed.
That's a very right word that you used.
Yeah, it is in the interest of the armed forces. We must learn from our mistakes. Otherwise, you know, how are we going to correct ourselves? So, you know,
Very true, sir.
like the Henderson Brook report not being revealed until now, what is the point? I mean, although it's all in the public domain already. So, I mean, it's all a healthy discussion.
Ramu, just for your information, there are two people in Chennai who held some very important posts in Sri Lanka operations. One is Colonel Vishwanathan, who was the town commandant of Jaffna.
I know.
And number two is Colonel Hariharan, who was the Colonel Intelligence.
Yeah, he was Colonel
Hariharan. He's very active and he writes a lot of articles about it.
I know.
He did not
Yes.
attend this.
Now, we also got our Major General Jose Manohar. He was
Yes,
there.
Jose
also.
Manohar was also there. So I don't know. I don't find their names here. They are not attending.
I think he must be there. He showed
No,
me.
his name
Sir,
is not there.
the inputs of General Jose were also part of the previous seminar. Inputs of Colonel Hariharan and the Colonel Vishwanathan from the office of the town commandant Jaffna, whereas the actual town commandant was Brigadier Riskalo. I mean, they were incorporated by Manoj Chanan in his talk, which he had given about the intelligence aspects. And it can be looked up on the YouTube. It is still there. It is posted on the YouTube.
87, when this was happening, I was actually already out of the army and as a civilian, and I was the corporate secretary in Madras.
Sir,
Those days it was Madras. And the general feeling was that we blundered so badly because not taking, we decided that, Prabhakaran will toe the line, whatever the government of India says. And he couldn't care less. That's what happened. He was never part of the deal. When he came in and they showed some, as if they're surrendering, and then it all boomerang back. It was
the discussions within our group, they indicate that in case there had been a psychoanalysis done of the personality of Prabhakaran and say Mathia and the others like Anton Balasingham, etc., it would have been distinctly clear that under no circumstances are they going to get involved in a democratic process, which was supposed to be part of the accord. So we have to say that inherently the flawed was accord. It was based upon flawed information also.
If I might intervene again.
Please.
Actually, I think from my experience of talking to people in Jaffna is that there was an inherent distrust of the Sinhala political leadership. That is something that even the LTT ingrained. They said every time Tamil politicians got some sort of an assurance from the Sinhala politicians, they always went back on it. And as a result of which, the distrust was so strong
So
that,
severe. Huh?
that there was no way when they surrendered, like I commanded 12 Gadwal, Sunil is there on this Zoom call also. 12 Gadwal was in Batiklova, and we had met all the LTT guys. We knew all the local leaders. We had visited their camps. We had seen their weaponry. But when it came to surrendering, we saw that they surrendered all, I mean, literally duds and stuff that were of no use to them. They hid away everything else, and then they just peeled off. One day they were in the camp. The next day when our people went to the camp, they had disappeared from those camps in Batiklova. Someone had asked about whether politicians or the diplomats have written anything. We have a nice book written by the then High Commissioner J.N. Dikshit called Assignment Colombo. It makes for very interesting reading, but then of course he doesn't make any untoward or any exceptional disclosures. Thank you.
Uses the observation which you made, that is also supported by the document of the Indo-peacekeeping of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. The reason that these very strict timelines were inside it was basically to deal with the possibility or an eventuality where the Sri Lankan government over a protected period of time may try to procrastinate or withdraw from whatever it is agreed to, and hence the aspects that the accord is deemed to be implemented with the immediate signing of the instrument. Also, that within 48 hours ceasefire is to take place. Within 72 hours, weapons are to be surrendered, and within 3 months, both the provinces are to be amalgamated. This was basically to ensure that the time is not given to the Sri Lankan government to carry out such activities, and also to assure the Tamil community that your interests are being looked after. In fact, I would say that under the given circumstances, the accord produced the best possible results for the Tamil community as far as the political outcome was concerned, within the constraints of it being within the framework of the Constitution of Sri Lanka. They got a unitary united province, which is the northern and the eastern provinces. They had the devolution of powers of 6 aspects, including the police also was there with them. So there was nothing better which the political community could have asked for. India did negotiate very well as far as the interests of the Tamils were concerned. It was only in safeguarding its own interests it faulted by giving the key ace to the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government interests were also looked after, wherein when we accepted that the unity and the territorial integrity of the Sri Lankan government will be guaranteed, and the accord, the political solution will be within the framework of the Constitution of Sri Lanka.
Any more questions? Thank you very much, Colonel Sidhu, for that absolutely analytical talk, and you're taken back to 1987 and all those.
So, thank you, sir. I wish to thank you and your organization for giving us the Emerald Island veterans to put across the correct perspective of the Operation Pavan. And I would request that in case the aspect of the recognition of the sacrifices of the 1,200 odd brave Indian soldiers in Sri Lanka is given a due cognizance. Thank you, sir. And thank you, readers, viewers.
To remember our heroes only. And thank you very much, all of you. I mean, not just the speaker, all of you for attending. And do keep attending our events again. I've not been able to normally announce the next event. Probably this week, you'll all be getting invites.
So anyone, sir, what time is the function on 29th?
29th, the function is starting off at the National War Memorial at 10:30. It is from 10:30 to 11.
29 July. No, we
29 July, New Delhi, National War Memorial,
yeah.
10:30 to 1100 hours.
Nice.
Thank you, sir.
Is
The
it,
dress code for the veterans is side cap, though optional, regimental tie, and military miniature medals.
I don't know whether anybody in Chennai will travel all that with the lockdowns, but anyway, Chennai may be having something as well.
Is it being aired YouTube wise, direct relay?
I am presently not aware whether it will be a live airing, but it is definitely being covered, and a video of that will definitely be uploaded on the YouTube. We'll share the
Excellent.
details with Colonel Ramchandran. He can share it within the group.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel.
Just for information, the Sri Lankan government has put up an excellent memorial for the
Yes,
IPF
yeah, I heard
soldiers.
that, yeah.
I had an opportunity to visit that a year ago. Only thing it's tucked away on one side, so it doesn't really make the main. It's not in the main thoroughfare or something that's visible. But there is an excellent memorial with the names of every soldier who had fallen in the cause of the IPKF.
In fact, here also there is a dichotomy. The numbers on the Sri Lankan War Memorial and the National War Memorial do not match. We want the government and the Ministry of Defense to ensure that they match.
Who's faulting more? We are faulted or they are faulted?
It's only when the proper review is carried out that it will be. As far as the Sri Lankan government is concerned, they are unlikely to be faulted, because in case the name of a battle casualty who's killed in action there is mentioned and he's actually not killed in action, there would have been an uproar by us up till now.
Okay,
They would have got the names of the government of India, as if they wouldn't have recorded it. So the government of India would have shared the names with them. And the government of India itself doesn't have a proper list. I mean, now I think they've reorganized their list and it's hopefully correct.
Okay, gentlemen, it's about time for us to close the event. Please stand by while I play the national anthem.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot to the viewers.
Very
sir.
well done, Colonel Sidhu.
Thank you,
God
sir.
bless.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
That's it. Good night, everybody. It's been
Good
a
night, sir. Bye, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Good night, everyone. Take care.